You're listening to the Vint Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast, a production of the Vint Marketplace, your source for premium wine and spirits at vintmarketplace.com. This episode is presented by Coravin. Coravin is the world leader in at-home wine preservation, allowing you to pour a glass of your favorite wine and enjoy more bottles in your cellar without ever having to pop the cork. And we are doing our last Coravin giveaway of the year, announcing that this episode. We gave away a Coravin Sparkling last time, and we're doing one more Coravin Sparkling, which is Coravin's newest system for consumers and enthusiasts. Billy and I both have one. We love it. It's amazing being able to pour a glass of champagne on a Tuesday and then use the Coravin, open it back up on Saturday or Sunday, and you have a perfectly preserved champagne. It's amazing. So we're excited to give away one more of these devices. After you listen through this episode, head over to our YouTube, find the episode on our YouTube. You can search in YouTube, Vint Wine TV, and find the episode and leave us a comment. Tell us something that you liked about the episode. Tell us a story about wines that you've had recently. If you're familiar with Terry, our guest today, let us know how you've engaged with some of his content. Leave us a comment and a note. Subscribe to the podcast there, Vint Wine TV on YouTube, and that will enter you to win one of our Coravin Sparkling systems, which we'll give away hopefully in time for the holidays. Billy, we've had a really good response about the last Sparkling that we gave away. People were excited about that one. I think that probably equally so this time as well.
Yeah, we really appreciate everybody who comments on YouTube. We had some folks also just email us suggestions for future episodes. We do appreciate that as well, but definitely go comment. That's the easiest way for us to tally, to be officially entered. But yeah, the Sparkling, as we've mentioned before, the Sparkling Coravin is amazing. And speaking of Sparkling, our guest today, Terry Theise, actually imported some of the earliest brewer champagnes to the US. But he is most well known for his importation of German and Austrian wines. Starting way back in the 80s, he was on the vanguard of bringing these German and Austrian wines over. I've really wanted to speak with him for a long time, so I'm really excited to have him on as a guest. He's basically one of these lifetime guys I've always wanted to talk to, and he's really one of these icons in the world of sommeliers and the wine world as a whole.
Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah, Terry he's a writer, he's a wine educator. He has his blog, and he's written a couple books. So yeah, it's great to have him on, be able to share decades now of knowledge that he's accumulated. Billy, why don't you take us into some of our news for the week? I know we had the rankings come out for LiveX's Power 100, where we can see how brands, producers from around the world fare in terms of global rankings.
Yeah, it's really exciting. Every year, LiveX comes out with its brand Power 100. And what they really do is they just take different data points from the platform of LiveX. So for those who aren't familiar with LiveX as a platform, it is a B2B wine trading platform only for companies, but it's where the highest volume of the top end of wines are traded in the world. So it's a really good barometer of how to see what trends are happening in the world of fine wine, because as those B2B companies, the businesses are trading, these wines are trickling down into the market. So it's retailers buying, it's wholesalers buying, it's importers buying. So it's a good really sense of what's happening in the market right now. And the kind of metrics they take into account for these are value traded on the platform for each wine or company, the average trading price, the total volume traded, and the price performance of a year, as well as the total unique wines that are traded. So that's like the different number of labels, as Brady would say, that are traded each year. This year was pretty exciting because we had a bit of a mix-up. For a really long time, Bordeaux and Burgundy had held the top spots and many of the top 20. But this year, a number of the Bordeaux and Burgundy dropped out of the top 100, and we had a new number one this year, and it was from Spain, Vega Sicilia. So that was really cool. And the other big news overall is that Italy got 9 new members into the top 100, and they rounded out the top 3 with both Gaia and Sanguido, which Tenuta Sanguido makes Sassicaia, for those that anybody didn't know.
Yeah, I don't think most people would guess that there's no Burgundy. It was until number 4 that you get a Burgundy producer. And then, yeah, to have Vega Sicilia, Gaia, and Sanguido in the top three. I don't, maybe no one would have guessed those three as being the top three.
Yeah. Yeah. In the recent years, you've really seen when it does come to Burgundy, and Loire is here at the top in the top 10, but the first Burgundy that comes up is Joseph Drouhin, and they do make amazing wines, but they tend to be, they're a negociant as well. So it's more this like volume play, as well as the average price might be a little lower than, say, a DRC, which had been in the top 10 for a number of years.
Yeah.
So it's been interesting to see how things have fluctuated this year. There's certainly a strong Bordeaux and Burgundy presence, but it's really cool to see the broadening of the top 100. I think since we started really talking about it 4 or 5 years ago, a lot of different countries are being added. So there's a little bit of representation from everywhere. And now, like with Spain and Italy actually topping the charts this year, it's showing how broad and global the quality wine scene really is.
Yeah. And this isn't like necessarily a popularity measure, but it's how often do your wines trade at, and relative to the total value of your wines, how often do they trade? Right. So you certainly might have producers who sell more wine, more of their wine is in the market. Maybe their bottle price is lower. It could be higher. It's more of an aggregate of trading volume than it is overall popularity. But still really interesting, especially when producers like Vega Sicilia, for instance, last year was ranked 56 on this list and now took the number 1 spot this year. So really cool.
Yep. And Domaine Laflay was number 1. They're down to 12. But yeah, it was like all those variables that I had mentioned earlier. Value traded, so like the total quantity there, or like the tallied up of all
dollar
the value
value
of all the trades. Yeah, exactly. And then the volume, so it's just your number of trades, and then the average trade price, which is those divided by each other, and then what did the price do as a whole for the year. And then I think the number of unique wines traded is always an interesting number for me, because I don't think that's impressive, and it's also something you can't really control. If you're a random producer, say like in, I don't know, South America somewhere, and you make 20 wines just because you can, and then if you're like a Burgundy producer and you make 20 wines, those are all different wines from different vineyards. So I think, to me, the metric of total wines is strange, and it doesn't really go into my calculation of a quality brand, but that's just
so that could be different labels from different vineyards, or it could be vintages, right?
Yeah, vintages too. That's true.
By nature, producers whose wines don't age for 90 years and who've only been around for, say, 40 years would have, I'm just thinking of Echem, for instance, in here, who you can drink their wines for 80, 90, 100 years plus, and they've been around forever. So for them to have a strong spot year after year, when you think about maybe a metric like a unique wines traded, that feels like they have like,
looking at the quantities here.
There's only 150. Yeah. Okay.
I think it's also different sizes of the bottles too. That all goes into it. But there's somebody like Giuseppe Rinaldi who only had 79 unique wines traded, and that's because they focus on making core Barolo, and they have many vintages of that Barolo in a relatively small range of sizes. So I think that's just something that is interesting. But yeah, I think it's an interesting barometer, and it's something for people to keep tabs on as they're out in the market. What we did in the Vint Marketplace news is we summarized this, but we linked directly to the LiveX report. There's most of LiveX's market data and insights is only available to businesses, but this one, they always make the report public. So I linked directly to it in the news. So if you guys want to go see what the full 100 looks like, you can read some of their additional analysis, like who joined this year, who moved out. Lopez de Heredia moved up a ton of spots and actually made the top 100 this year, which I'm really excited to see. So I really highly recommend kind of diving in and going through some more of the nitty gritty than we have done here.
Yeah, awesome. Why don't you tell us about Terry Theise? I actually hadn't been on to too much of his stuff until you came on the podcast and you actually did the interview. So he's got a ton of content out there, his blog and several books. So I thought it was cool that you guys got to have that conversation.
Yeah, I wish you could have joined. He's somebody I've always wanted to talk to. So it was meta going like all the way back to when I first started learning about wine. I tried to find any podcast I could listen to about wine that was actually helpful. He was on a podcast that's no longer available because the host has been, turns out he wasn't a great guy, and he was part of the Me Too cleaning out of the quartermaster sommeliers. It's that great interview. Not that the guy did a good job, but Terry's great interview is no longer there. But that podcast I listened to, and I was like, I'm going to learn about wine. And since he's a German and Austrian wine importer, and this was a sommelier podcast, they dove like very deeply, very quickly into the most complicated terms that I had ever heard. And
Yeah.
and once you understand how German wine laws kind of work, it makes a little bit more sense. But they talked about the VDP, which I had no idea what that was. They talked about different levels of sweetness in German wines. They talked about specific vineyards. And I thought it was the coolest thing. I literally listened to that podcast over and over and over until I could at least mime back what he was saying. It took me years to grasp what he was actually talking about. At one point, he mentioned how a barrel of German Spätburgunder was traded for a barrel of DRC, but he called DRC's, he's Romani Conti. And I was like, what the hell? Why did he say it twice? What is this guy talking about? We know what Romani Conti is. And I didn't realize he was talking about like the vineyard Romani Conti, like made by DRC, that wine. And so this specific podcast has been playing in my head for years. And as I mentioned earlier in this episode, Terry basically was on the vanguard of bringing in the top of German wines and the top Austrian wines to the US. Like people always give like Kermit Lynch a lot of props for his on the wine trail and bringing in French wines and introducing a lot of wines to the world. Terry was like the guy, and he's basically considered like a German and Austrian wine god in the wine community for all of these producers that he discovered and then shared with the US. And today his portfolio that he had built, it was under his own name for a long time. And he worked for Skurnik Wine Imports. So a lot of those wines are still actually with the Skurnik portfolio. We actually sell a lot of them too, because we direct import as well. But it was really cool. And so the goal, sorry to be so long-winded here, that I wanted to do after hearing that really helpful and interesting podcast, it really kicked off my wine journey. I wanted to do something similar. So in this podcast, we talk about German and Austrian Riesling, like what they taste and smell like, how you can tell the difference between the two. We also talk about German and Austrian reds, the different variations and styles that you would want to look for. We talk about producers you want to look for. And he gives you a little bit of background on how to pick good wines, what they should taste like, how they should be represented in the glass. It really walks you through. So really interesting stories that he's telling, but also informative and something that I wish I had when I was first starting as a wine person and just trying to get to know German and Austrian wines better.
Yeah, and a lot of the wines from regions that you discuss in the episode are, just to put it in context for many of our listeners, they're some of the most ageable. They can be some of the most ageable wines in the world, some of the most food-friendly wines in the world. They're categories that, yeah, you may have maybe a little bit higher barrier of entry just because of some of the language things and some of the differences in the way they designate wines across those regions, especially in Germany. But start dipping your toe into Germany and Austria, I think opens up a whole world of food and wine pairing and collecting to folks who are enthusiasts. So it's definitely worth listening on normal speed. I don't know. I was listening to someone said the other day about how they listen to all their podcasts on 2x speed, which I can't listen to something and do a thing. And I never listen to podcasts on 2x speed. This is one you want to slow down if you're someone that does that and listen to Terry's descriptions.
Yeah. It'll be hard to catch some of the German words even on normal speed. But yeah, completely agree. Definitely something to listen to again multiple times. I'm actually going to go back and listen to it again myself. I've been to a tasting since this recording with just wines that he recommended. There was a Riesling tasting there,
cool.
and it was absolutely phenomenal. And it's so cool once you get these little bits of information and you can just go down and actually like act upon them. And that's the beauty of German and Austrian wines, is they're still such great value. You can get some of the top producers, top vineyards for much cheaper than you can a lot of the French wines of similar quality. So I definitely highly recommend everybody go seek those out after they listen.
Yeah, very good. Well, before we get into today's episode, remember, if you're looking to drink more wine from your cellar without worrying about wasting what you can't consume, one of the Coravin systems will certainly be your best friend. And we're actually giving away one of these systems, and talked about it earlier in the podcast. But if you go to Vint Wine TV on YouTube, you find this episode, drop us a comment, share something about your wine journey under the episode, and hit subscribe to the channel, we will be giving away one of the new Coravin Sparkling systems. So preserve your sparkling and champagne style wines. You can also visit coravin.com and use code VINT15 for 15% off any of your purchases on their website if you want to buy a gift for Christmas. And if you're a member of the trade, visit trade.coravin.com and you can get exclusive discounts on the full range of products and accessories for both home and for work. So head over there, enter to win this current giveaway. It'll be our last one for this year. Hopefully we can get it in your hands before Christmas. And without further ado here is our conversation, or Billy's conversation, with guest Terry Theise.
Hi, Terry. Thanks so much for joining today.
Thanks for having me.
So as I would have mentioned in our introduction, I'm really excited to finally get to talk to you. It's been years that I've kind of been following you from the beginning of my career when I first heard a podcast with you on to help kickstart my interest into the nitty gritty of Austrian wines, German wines, and a whole bunch of stuff. So can you give our listeners a little bit of a background on who you are and how you got your career started?
Yeah, I got my career started. I'm going to compress this story because it could take a long time. But I got my career started. I was working as a wholesale salesperson for a distributor in Washington, D.C., a mid-sized distributor. And they hired me reluctantly because I had no experience, and I don't think there was anything in my personality that gave them the impression that I could sell anything. But Bobby Catcher was one of their suppliers, a very large supplier of fine wine. And I had met Bobby, and Bobby called them and said, "You really need to hire this guy." So they hired me. They paid me next to nothing. They threw me in to a territory that consisted of all the accounts that we had either never called on or had been thrown out of. And I really just had to sink or swim. But I knew how to get along with a wide variety of people. I was working around the army for a while when I lived in Munich. So it was very easy just to get along with a wide range of people who were not like me. And so I ended up doing reasonably well as a distributor salesperson. I ended up finally being transferred into the fine wine department, such as it was. And then eventually I was promoted to head that department, again, which I had no qualifications to do. And it was around about then that we were selling German wine. And I was a German wine specialist, and everybody knew it. And I was considered to be the go-to guy in the DC market for German wine. But we were buying this wine from other importers. And I realized that we could import directly based upon the contacts that I had made when I lived in Germany. And by importing directly, you know what, you eliminate the middleman. And if you eliminate the middleman's profit margin, then either you can absorb all of it and make this like shit ton of money, or you can absorb part of it and still make more than your usual markup and still look cheap to the trade. So I went to the owner of the company, proposed that idea. He was very skeptical, and he asked me what the upfront investment would be. And I said, "Oh, you just got to send me to Germany for a couple of weeks to put a portfolio together." And he thought it over. And obviously the idea of making Bafo markup was very appealing to him. So he said, "I'll send you over for a week." That's what happened. So I went over, I looked up all my old buddies. I put together a little tiny offering, like 6 growers or something like that, and sold the wines in the local market and did well. In effect, we were off and running. Problem was that as head of the fine wine department, I had underestimated what a political position that was and how much hand-holding you needed to do with suppliers and what kind of personality you had to have to succeed in that job. It was one thing to motivate salespeople. That came easily to me. But the thing that was really difficult was to sit down with a rep for a supplier who really gave us schlock and pretend that I cared. So I realized my days were going to be numbered doing that. And I then moved along, and the rest is history, basically. And it moved along to other companies, daddy companies, basically, where I could do this and do what I knew I could do well and what I was impassioned to do. And that's how it all began. I know you were alluding to wanting to know how the market was when I started. And the fact of the matter is, the market sucked when I started. It was in 1985, going back a ways, there was a so-called Great German Vintage in 1983. It was great because it was the first kind of good vintage in about 5 or 6 years. It was overrated, but that's neither here nor there. But it was a very plentiful vintage, and the dollar was really strong. So prices for the wines were aggressive because there was a lot of wine, and the growers were concerned about selling it. And because the dollar was so strong, our acquisition prices were very cheap. So the market was flooded with 1983 vintage German wines at rock bottom prices. In the 2 years in the interim between then and when I began in 1985, the dollar tanked, And the vintage which I started with, was 84, was not so hot. I came into a market that was, let us say, not welcoming. But that's not such a bad thing. But it teaches you to be enterprising and resourceful and creative, which turned out to be very useful characteristics to acquire if I was going to try and sell German wine to a market that really didn't care all that much about it.
Yeah. Was there like a demand in general? And I guess, could you also take a little step back to talk about how you were inspired while you were in Germany, to taste and got intrigued into German wine?
Yeah, it was partly coincidence of my happening to live in Germany. Sometimes I wonder, I lived in Munich. What if I lived in, I don't know, Siena? Maybe I would have been the Chianti Classico guy. But as it happened, I lived in Munich. German wine regions were the ones that were closest to me. And of course, it was very easy to obtain the wines. I just loved the wines. Riesling blew my mind. And everybody has this wine moment sometime in our by their either professional careers or just our personal careers with wine, where you drink something and you just have the WTF reaction. It's just like, how can anything taste like this? And then you try and learn enough that you don't just stumble upon wines like that randomly. You need to get a map that will guide you towards them so that you can know what you're buying. So all of that happened while I was in Germany. And so it happened with German wines. And the first immersion that I had in the wines was visiting the regions and dealing with individual growers. My imprinting in wine was that the things that mattered about wine were, first, where it came from, where it grew. And second, that the person who was shepherding those wines into the bottle ultimately was very intimately connected to his vineyards. That to me was what wine meant. And I've never really had any reason to change my mind about that. The whole subject of my second book, which was What Makes a Wine Worth Drinking, was that what makes a wine worth drinking is that connection, that artisanal connection between the producer and the land. And it doesn't guarantee the wine will be great, because sometimes the land is ordinary and sometimes the producer is lazy or untalented. But it seems to me to be the foundation without which wine essentially means nothing. It can taste good. You can make, if you're talented at mass producing industrial wine, it can taste good. It has a function to serve, but it doesn't mean anything. So that was kind of me. And so Germany was I would describe it as a happy coincidence.
That makes sense. And then, so you started there, came back, was there like a demand in the market? And then, I guess, two-part question again. One is, were people drinking things beyond Blue Nun at this time, or was like an idea of a Spätlese being 10 years old and interesting?
There was a small market for high kind of specialty German wines. The structure of that market was out of sync with the nature of the market. The German wine market was structured in those days for what they called the top estates, or the so-called top estates, was structured like the Bordeaux market, where the top estates would simply float offerings to a community of brokers, and those brokers would float the offerings internationally, including to the US. But the production structure in Germany was much more aligned to Burgundy, with like tons and tons and tons of little growers and importers like Kermit Lynch and among others who were going over and tasting and selecting. And Germany didn't really have that person. And I know I looked at it and I thought, because I knew Bobby Catcher very well, and that's what the work that Bobby was doing, and I was watching him do it. And I said, Germany needs that person. And since I know a little bit about it, and I'm too stupid to imagine how easily I might have failed, I decided to nominate myself to be that person. And so that's basically how it happened. The market was mediocre. Obviously, there was a pretty large market for schlock at that point. But the high watermark for the Blue Nuns of the world actually happened when I started in 1985, coincidentally. That was their biggest year in the US market, and their sales began to decline from then on. And I sold to a little community of wine nerds who were interested enough to figure they could get on the ground floor with a guy like me. And my clientele increased pretty substantially when I got Parkerized. Bob Parker, I was in the DC area, and Bob lived a little north of Baltimore. And he wasn't the Grand Panjandrum then that he soon became. And so we had a lot of people who knew him and me. So we had friends in common. And one of them just put us together. And Bob was looking like he wanted a story. Like all wine writers, they wanted a story. So he figured, all right, I'll spend an afternoon, I'll taste with this crazy guy. And maybe it's a story and maybe it isn't. But if it's not, then all I lost was an afternoon. But the wines were good. And he recognized good wine. And a few months later, I was getting scores. And when I was getting scores, my phone started ringing. And at that point, I was selling wine in 4 or 5 states. And literally in a period of a week, I gained new customers in 15 or 20 states. So, Parker was, for all the criticism that he's received over the years, what people tend to forget is the role that he played in making the wine market safe for little artisan importers like myself. He made the climate for people like me to succeed. And that is, to me, obviously, that's huge. And he doesn't get the credit that he deserves for the role that he played in doing that.
That's really interesting. For consumers who are looking for wines, aside from maybe, I guess they can look at scores now, they can look at reviewers. One thing that really stuck out to me when I was first starting and learning anything about wine was when I listened to your podcast, was talking about the VDP and what that was. And now whenever I see an eagle on a bottle, I'm like, it's probably good. Is that still the case? Or is there how have things gone? And what are some tips people can look for to find good German wines on their own?
I would put it this way. Nearly every producer in the VDP are among the best producers in Germany. But there are outstanding producers who are not in the VDP. While the VDP is a reasonably accurate guarantee of high quality, there is high quality outside of the VDP. So the absence of VDP on the label does not mean that the wine is going to be mediocre. There are producers who simply prefer to be non-aligned nations. And Selbach Oster is a classic example of that. But I'll tell you something interesting. In my career, on the front page of my website, I have a list of producers whom I represented who subsequently became VDP producers. So in effect, I hate to use the word discovered, but in effect, I discovered them. And then in the fullness of time, they became VDP producers. And some of them are very large names. For example, Willi Schaefer was not a VDP producer. Müller-Catoir was not a VDP producer. And the list goes on.
Awesome. Could you explain quickly, I know it's hard to explain quickly, what the VDP is, just for people who may not know?
Yeah, it's a 100-plus-year-old organization that was basically formed by a group of top producers who pledged to only sell unchaptalized wine and also create an auction system for marketing those wines. And it's morphed and changed a lot over the years. I think, honestly, there was a long point in my career where I was anti-VDP. And because I didn't like a lot of the things that they were doing. But in the last 5-10 years, most of my objections, I would say nearly all of them, have been satisfied. And I have a lot of admiration at this point for what the VDP is doing. There are still a few things that I would quibble with, but I'm a contrarian by nature. But I think at this point, the VDP is doing much more good than it is doing harm. And the harm that it is doing is picayune. It's just little shit that wine geeks argue with one another about. So generally speaking, I'm gung-ho for the VDP.
Cool. And then if people want to find VDP wines, just look at the neck of the bottle and it'll have an eagle and a little bunch of grapes below that. And there's a lot more detail on that, but we don't need to get into it here. Cool. So you discovered German wines. As you mentioned, you were basically the Kermit Lynch for the equivalent of that for German wines, for Austrian wines, and really brought them to the US. And we appreciate you for that. So how did you go from Germany and moving into Austria? I know you had mentioned before, while they speak the same language, it's very different in terms of culture and wine scene. So can you give us a little bit about that transition?
Yeah, there's a lot of people that feel like Austria is an adjunct to Germany, which it's not. It's if you are driving from Frankfurt to Vienna, even with the wind on your back and no traffic on the Autobahn, you're going to be driving for 8.5 hours. So it's a long way, and it's a long way culturally, and it's a long way in terms of terroir. And it's also a long way in terms of climate, because Germany's climate is maritime. Most of its weather blows off the Atlantic. Austria's climate is continental. So it's warmer, it's drier, it's a little further south. German Riesling tends to occur right around 50 degrees north latitude, give or take. Austria is more like 47.5. Austria is closer. For example, if you draw a line, a latitudinal line between Burgenland in Austria, and just draw that line west, it will hit France in Dijon. So it's more or less like Burgundy. And okay, it was actually Stuart Piggott who was responsible for introducing me to Austrian wine. I had been reading about them. This would have been in the early 90s, because they had emerged from the glycol scandal and were reinventing themselves as a youthful artisanal production culture, which really was a revolution in Austria. And so I'd been reading about the wines. And one night I had dinner with Stuart and at his then dwelling in Bernkastel. And as I was leaving in the wee hours of the morning, he asked me if I wanted to see his cellar. So I was looking at the cellar, and there were a couple of bottles of Austrian wine standing on top of a barrel. And I saw the label of Knoll. And you probably know that label, which is extremely ornate with the saint on it and everything. I looked at it and I said, my goodness, what is this? And Stuart said, oh, you don't know that? And I said, no, I don't know that. And he said, you're not leaving now. So we went back upstairs, again in the wee hours of the morning. And I tasted Prager, Knoll, and FX Pichler with him. And after those three wines, I was like, wow, this is a story that needs to be told. The next vacation opportunity that I had, I spent a week in and around the Wachau. And at the end of that week, I just said, this is crazy. These are world-class wines. And at this point, we're getting in on the ground floor. And the only people who were similarly interested was Seth Allen at Vindivino. And Seth became interested because he was friends with Louis Krafter. So his orientation in the early days was Krafter and sweet wines. And I looked at it differently. And I was looking at all these fabulously intricate, complex, minerally dry Gruner Veltliner and Riesling. And I just thought, oh man, this is, like I said, this is a story that has to be told. So again, it was a rock that had to be pushed up a hill because there was a lot of skepticism. There was just enough business in the early days to keep the little boat afloat. And then we had the Gruner Veltliner craze in the late 90s, which gave enough, what's the word I'm looking for? It was just enough material to keep the business going. And Austria still, in my view, even now, doesn't do the business in the U.S. market that it should do based on the quality and value of the wines.
Yes, I completely agree. I feel like I'm, even in my short time compared to yours in the wine industry, I've been banging that drum. How would you compare, and I know it's just going to require broad generalizations, but Austrian Riesling to German Riesling, if people were just to make blanket statements?
If we compare apples to apples, which is to say dry wines to dry wines,
Mm-hmm.
and generally speaking, the German wines will be a little sleeker in body, a little less opulent. If you have them side by side, you would notice that the Austrian wine seemed a little juicier. I think that has to do with its slightly more southerly position and the different kind of kilocalories of sunlight that it gets vis-a-vis Germany. Minerality is more or less similar, but the German wine, and this is something that I've really found to be fascinating over the years, you can get remarkable intricacy and complexity with dry German Riesling in and out of the GG category. And you can get it with 12.5% alcohol. And that's very difficult to do in Austria. In Austria, you need 13, if not 13.5, before you get full physiological ripeness. And then you get the whole panoply of flavors that Riesling is capable of. But you can do it in Germany with 12.5. And that, I think, is miraculous. I'm a wine drinker. I love to drink wine, and I want maximum flavor with minimum alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
That's my religion. It enables me to drink more. And also, I don't like the feeling of inebriation. That's how it is. It's really fascinating. When I first started visiting Austria, you couldn't find German wines there. And for perfectly good reasons. They said, we have our own. And then there was a tariff barrier between, Austria was not in the EU at that point, and there was a tariff barrier between Austria and Germany. Now you can find German wines, and all the top somms in Austria have dry German wines on their list and sweet German wines on their list as well. So every once in a while, when I'm in Austria for a bit and I'm with an Austrian and we're having dinner, let's drink German wine tonight just for shits and giggles, because I haven't had German wine since I got here, and you don't drink it very often probably. Let's rock and roll. And when we do drink them, it's really fascinating how different they are. And you really feel like you have moved north with all that implies. And again, I think it's fascinating. I wouldn't want to live without either of them. But this is the final answer to your question. And I think this still is important. It is still possible to get dry Riesling in Germany that's pretty nasty, that's not ripe enough, that has too much acidity, that's shrill. And that is next to impossible in Austria. You can get ordinary wines or mediocre wines from Riesling, but you won't get nasty wines because the basis, they're always going to be physiologically ripe. And so you will always have the acidity is different, of course. It's structured differently and it's less high. So usually by 1 gram per liter, all things being equal. So if an Austrian grower has Riesling with 7.5 grams per liter of acidity, to him, that's high. That's almost dangerously high. The German grower would think that's maybe a little on the low side. On the other hand, for the GGs, it's ideal because you don't want too much acidity for those. It was really fascinating. If you added Alsace into that mix as the third sort of in the triumvirate of great Riesling terroirs, then you'd have yet a third variation. And Alsace, obviously now, is just emerging from its identity crisis. But thankfully, there is now a pretty robust and growing community of excellent dry Rieslings coming from Alsace. And we're talking, Billy, about dry Rieslings. Sweet Riesling is not anathema to me, obviously, but it's becoming more and more of a minority citizen in Germany, which is in a way too bad, but because it has such a unique role to play that honestly no other wine can possibly play. We had a pork shoulder roast last night from the Campo Grande people, this fantastic Spanish Iberico pork. And we roasted some squash. We filled the squash with quinoa. We made a salad with sauteed pears. And what are you going to drink with that if not German Riesling?
Exactly.
And it's not like we had to diddle the food. Oh, we must make the food sweet in order to drink this Riesling. It was just the exact perfect wine to drink with that food. And so it has a unique and precious function to serve.
What would you see in the Alsatian Rieslings? Is it just higher alcohol and just riper fruit profiles in general, or?
Yeah, I think that's generally the case. It's now with the new climate era, it's become a strange place to grow grapes. Mm-hmm. It's very warm in Alsace, and it tends to be very dry because the Vosges act as a kind of a rain and wind shadow. And the Alsace grower has to work hard to get ripe fruit with an eventual alcohol below 14.
Yep.
And that they need a lot of creativity, and there's a lot of ideas that are being banged around. There's also been premix problems with Alsatian Riesling in the last 10 years. And which is weird because it seems only to be happening to Riesling. And try finding dry Pinot Gris in Alsace with less than 14% alcohol. It's next to impossible. Same problem with Gewürztraminer. Even if you can find dry Gewürztraminer, and if you could, now you're talking in many cases about 14.5 as a minimum of alcohol. So they've got to work that out, but they have fantastic terroirs. And good, smart growers will work it out. But I find Alsace and Germany are siblings because it's in the same valley. Pfalz and Alsace are, in effect, just two occupants of the same pole. And Austria is the odd man out because they're so far away.
Yeah. So before I want to touch on the reds from both Germany and Austria shortly, but for Gruner, before we move on, I know you had mentioned every good wine list should have 20 Gruners. What is can you quickly walk us through maybe some of the variants between like certain parts of the like Wachau and like Kremstal, Kamptal, what people could expect? Yeah.
First of all, Gruner Veltliner is, to my way of thinking, the most flexible dry white wine in the world at the table, even more than Riesling. And that's because Gruner Veltliner will go with foods that are unfriendly to Riesling. And the cliche isn't, but the cliche is true, that Gruner will go with a lot of things that nothing else goes with, artichokes being top of that list, for example. Great with mushrooms, great with shellfish, great with all the brassicas. One of my little comic lines when I used to do tastings for the public is I would say, if it stinks up your house when you cook it, then you should drink Gruner Veltliner with it. So you have that in its favor vis-a-vis Riesling. But really, I think Gruner Veltliner is less regionally specific than it is terroir specific. So you have two fundamental terroirs that Gruner Veltliner is planted on. One is primary rock and the other is Loess. The Loess Gruner Veltliners are the softer, sweeter ones, not sweet in terms of sugar, sweet just in terms of kindness, friendliness. They have this, I used to call it flowering fields aroma or wet cereal aroma. They have a sensation of sweetness without residual sugar. And they tend to be more in the sort of legume direction. And on primary rock, that's really where you get pepper, and spiciness and the rhubarb flavors and the flavors of all the kind of peppery members of the green family, like arugula, maizuna, mustard greens, et cetera, et cetera. And there's overlap between the two, but the most peppery Gruner Veltliners will be the ones that grow in primary rock. And I'll get an argument from some of my friends who grow Gruner Veltliner on Loess, but it's the law of generalities. The generalities are never more than generally true, but they are generally true for a good reason. So that's the way I look at it. In the Wachau, to the degree that Gruner Veltliner is planted on Loess, it would tend to be the Federspiels. The top Gruner Veltliners are almost always the ones that are planted in primary rock. In some cases, you have primary rock in the subsoils and topsoil of Loess. For example, I'm having a senior moment here. It is, I'm sorry, I've simply lost it. It's one of big Gruner Veltliner vineyard. Pichler has it, Alzinger has it, Leubenberg. And where Riesling grows on Leubenberg, it grows on naked primary rock. Where Gruner Veltliner grows, it grows on primary rock with a topsoil of Loess. So there are instances where you have them both. And then sometimes, like in Achleiten, you have incredibly complex soil that's got everything but the kitchen sink in it. So anyways, that's for me, that's the fundamental distinction for Gruner Veltliner and the sort of soil that it grows in. It's just, to me, it's just absolutely indispensable because it is so flexible at the table. And all things equal, it still offers incredible value for money. It's just, that's Gruner Veltliner. It's my dry wine best friend.
Yeah, no, I agree. Now I'm going to seek a few of those out and try to dive more into the terroir. Cool. So let's move on to the reds. I've been excited to talk about these two. You want to start with the Austrian reds? Because I guess those are closer to my heart, although I do love German Pinot Spätburgunder as well. So let's start with the Austrian reds. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, for me, the most important claim that Austria has to stake for its red wines are for its native varieties, which is to say, first and foremost, Blaufränkisch, and then St. Laurent, and then Zweigelt, which is actually a crossing of Blaufränkisch and St. Laurent. And Blaufränkisch, it grows in Germany. It's usually called Lemberger, but there are a few growers now planting Blaufränkisch and bottling it as Blaufränkisch because it's becoming apparent what fantastic wines this grape variety can make. And what I like to say about Blaufränkisch is it's the red wine for white wine drinkers because it excels in minerality and herbaceousness, and it has very little fruit, but it has every possible berry. And that's Blaufränkisch. And when you get a good one, It comes onto the palate. The first thing you taste is pepper because there's a lot of pepperiness in Blaufränkisch. Next thing is you'll taste this kind of almost garrigue, this kind of sense of herbs that have been boiled in the sun. And then you'll get all the berries. And you'll get this amazing juiciness, which is really counterintuitive for a wine that, like I say, doesn't have much fruit. And so it was an acquired taste for me. In my early days, I was a Zweigelt and St. Laurent guy. But when I started tasting the heights that Blaufränkisch could reach, then it was just like, wow. And this is something that everyone should know about. St. Laurent is a diva in the vineyards. It's a very difficult variety to grow. It's sensitive to everything that can go wrong in the growing season. And at the end of the growing season, it produces a very tight cluster of very thin-skinned berries, which means botrytis, essentially. So it needs a lot of work in terms of canopy, in terms of bunch thinning, yada, yada. But the results, when it's good, are incredible. And for me, really good Blaufränkisch is like having a kind of red Burgundy in the animal direction, blended with maybe 10% Gigondas. And I find Blaufränkisch, I find St. Laurent amazing. And the other thing is amazing about St. Laurent is you don't need to put it in wood to bring out this smoky flavor. I used to work with a guy called Sattler who bottled a basic St. Laurent. Now you've got Blaufränkisch on my brain. Bottled a basic St. Laurent in stainless steel. And I would show it to customers and they would go, oh, what effective use of oak. And I would say, tremendously effective because there is none. And where's that smokiness come from? It's in the variety. Zweigelt is like the Beaujolais of Austria. And it's just happy-go-lucky gulper wine. But there are producers who have started to wonder, what if we took it seriously? What might it produce? And so there is an ever-growing community of people trying to make really important Zweigelt. And to some degree, it's succeeding. So those are, to the extent that they are a unique contribution that Austria makes to the world, I find they're the most important varieties. You do have producers in Austria growing all kinds of stuff. There are people trying to make a go with Pinot Noir. There was a Cabernet Sauvignon craze that is now thankfully declining. And every now and again, you'll find a grower that's got this or that planted. In their early days, they were terribly eager to prove that they belonged on the international stage. And so they grew international varieties and they put them in lots of new oak. And eventually they outgrew that. It was a puberty for Austrian red wine. And then they started saying, we have some good stuff here of our own. And it's so good, we don't really need to put all this pancake makeup of new wood over it. And every grower for a while felt like they had to make a super Tuscan. And even that craze is now diminishing. And you find fewer and fewer growers who are making these big deal cuvées with lots of new oak. So I see red wine in Austria right now being an emerging culture with great healthiness.
Nice.
Fantastic, really a fantastic place to explore.
Agreed. And I also think some rosés made from some of these varieties actually provide a lot of way more complex and depth and acid than a lot of equivalent wines for the price point too. So even beyond just reds.
Yeah. When we talk about peppery with Gruner Veltliner and Blaufränkisch, this is literally true. The molecule that is responsible for the pepper flavor, rotondone, has its highest concentration in those two grape varieties.
Wow. I didn't know that about Blaufränkisch too, like in terms of the concentration. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Let's pivot back to Germany for a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about, this is actually in the first podcast I had heard years from over 10 years ago now. You were talking about Spätburgunder and how it was beginning to climb up the charts. I think it's now reached a level of, at least in the wine industry, respect and notoriety.
Thankfully and deservedly. I worked way back in the early 90s with, I think, possibly one of the first 5 growers in all of Germany to say, if we took Pinot Noir seriously, we could probably make serious wine from it. In those days, most German Pinot Noir was honestly looked more like rosé and had the body of rosé and very often had residual sugar also. But so that was the sort of the birth of that movement. And I worked with a grower named Lingenfelder, who was very much a mover and shaker. I also worked with Kurla Ruprecht, who took Pinot Noir very seriously. So now that whole idea has caught fire, thanks partly to climate change. I think there's a really fantastic community right now of excellent Pinot Noir being made in Germany. They have also outgrown what their cousins in Austria outgrew, which was the idea that you needed to paper the wines over with a lot of new oak in order for people to take them seriously, and that you had to pick them overripe where they would get what the Germans are calling the marmalade flavor. So there's a lot of retreat back from that. And what I'm seeing right now are just a lot of really beautiful, wholesome, interesting Pinot Noirs using Burgundy as their North Star, but not trying to copy Burgundy. And if you talk to a guy like Christian Dautel, who was in my portfolio, he will say he did an apprenticeship in Burgundy and was amazed by the wines. He said, I couldn't fathom how much depth of flavor they could have without so much intensity. And they had this sort of improbable lightness and at the same time more complexity than any red wine I had ever tasted. And he brought that sensibility back with him to Germany. And so that's what his Pinot Noirs are like. And he is far from alone. There's lots and lots and lots of people doing fascinating things with Pinot Noir in Baden, in the Pfalz, and elsewhere. And we even have viable Pinot Noir being made in the Mosel of all places. And climate change is responsible for a lot of it. But you know what happens? Know-how is a funny thing. It's not that you necessarily have to study what someone else is doing specifically, but as know-how in general increases, it seems to soak into each individual by osmosis almost. And so you've got people who honestly have no business being able to make good Pinot Noir in the localities that they're making it from, but they're able to do it somehow. And yeah, look, it's a phenomenon that probably would get more attention if it was happening in a country other than Germany. But because it is happening in Germany, it's something that we need to hammer the market about. But honestly, right now, I don't think there's better value for excellent Pinot Noir from anywhere in the world. And if you're curious about it, don't think Oregon probably more than California in terms of stylistic preference and also in terms of the production culture. Because Oregon's like all these hippie growers that are just making really cool Pinot Noirs in many cases. And you see a lot of that in Germany as well.
Do you think part of the reason it hasn't gotten as much notoriety is because they keep putting Spätburgunder instead of Pinot Noir? I know some producers put Pinot Noir, but...
Yeah, I was always mixed emotions about that. On one hand, it would have makes an easier sell if it says Pinot Noir. On the other hand, I think the Germans should be proud of their language and bottle their wines, label them as they please. But what can you do? People are very comfortable with French wine, though they may not speak French, and if they attempt to, they might mispronounce it. And there's a lot of kind of odd Gallic theological complexities in French wine that don't seem to deter people. But there does seem to be an odd mentality whereby when you approach wine from German-speaking countries, you assume you will not be able to understand them. And that assumption is obviously incorrect. In fact, the Germans are making it unbelievably clear to figure out what it is that they're doing. But if you can pronounce Cabernet Sauvignon, you can probably manage Spätburgunder.
I agree. Yeah. If anything, the Germans provide too much information about what they're doing as opposed to the other way around.
If I were 30 years younger and I was going to try and establish a portfolio for the first time, I would be very tempted to create a portfolio consisting of nothing but German Pinot Noir.
Wow.
25 growers, all the wide variety of options and possibilities and terroirs. I think it would make for a fascinating portfolio.
Just quickly listing. So you mentioned Baden, Pfalz. There's some Pinot Noir being grown like Franken as well. Where else should people be looking?
Rhine, Hessen has now some very interesting Pinot Noir producers. Even people who at one point probably said that they would never even try to make red wine. They're seeing the success that others are having. They're tasting the results and they're thinking we should try that also. I would say almost look grower by grower rather than region by region. Traditional region obviously was the Rheingau with Assmannshausen. If you look, for example, at what Künstler is doing, he has Pinot Noir from Hochheim, his home village, and Pinot Noir from Assmannshausen, basically bracketing the entire Rheingau. And they are as different as night and day.
Wow.
Qualitatively, they are, like, how could you even say it? As different as Pommard and Volnay, although obviously there's a mentality saying Pommard and Volnay are not all that different. But these variations in style and personality are what would be very tempting to me if I were trying to put a big old portfolio together.
That makes a lot of sense. So we're getting close to wrapping up here, but I quickly wanted to touch on, you were mentioning growers there. You also have imported before, and you also focused a little bit on some champagne growers. You want to just quickly mention a few of the growers that you got into over the years and what people should be looking for there that are under the radar in terms of champagne?
Yeah, that was a really fun story. There were very few grower champagnes on the market, and I had pretty much drunk my way through them. And I became aware that there was a grower culture in Champagne, but I was interested in examining it, but I wasn't interested in working with it professionally. And having made the trip and tasted some wine and met some people, I remember we were driving back to Germany, and my wife said to me, "You really should do this. You should do this professionally. These are outstanding wines." And I said, "But darling, I'm already pushing a rock up a hill with Germany, and I've got a grand piano strapped to my back with Austria. Just how difficult do you want my life to be?" And she said, "But what if someone else does it and it wasn't you? How would you feel?" And I said, "I would feel like I didn't have any cojones." And she said, "Then you've answered your own question. You have to do it." So again, it was counterintuitive. I didn't have any notion that it would be successful, but the growers were outstanding. And what I was learning about Champagne was that there were terroir distinctions and there were micro terroirs, and there were even terroir distinctions in the Côte de Blanc, just between Cuisse and Cramant and Avis and Auger and Le Mesnil. And I thought, wow, again, no one is talking about Champagne this way. And the big negociants were more like, I don't know, like big whiskey in the way they were describing their products and in the way they were sharing, which was to say not sharing information with their customers. So again, I saw a story to tell. And when I began, there were 33 grower champagnes exported to the US. The last time I looked, there were over 400.
Wow.
Yeah. And right now, I would say you really need to trust your importer. Or whoever it is who is your vendor, you need to be able to trust that person's palate, because though the number of good growers in Champagne continues to grow, and there's also a new generation making family champagnes whereas their parents didn't, there aren't 450 good growers in Champagne. There just aren't. There's maybe 45 or 50 who are really first class. And then there's another 75, maybe 100 after that who are very good. And then after that, there's a community of okay to good growers. And then after that, there's not much. Just because it's got a grower's name on the label doesn't mean that you shouldn't look into it before you buy it blind. But Champagne is healthy right now. Generally speaking, the really unanticipated result of the work that I did, and others as well, is that the artisan mentality has actually even crept into the negociant community in Champagne. They're making better wines than they ever did. They're sharing more information with their customers than they ever did. They're respecting their customers more than they ever did. And they were under threat from the grower community. And they said, we need to do something about this. And honestly, bless them, they did. The negociant Champagne culture, when I started, was really despicable. And at this point, I would say it's respectable.
Wow. Progress.
No negativity about, certainly there are some are better than others, but we know now who they are.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting in the Somm world. Everybody's talking about specific growers that they like now. It's not even growers champagne is a thing. And then I think now even in the mass population of champagne lovers, people are looking at more of these single bottlings, single like vineyard bottlings from some of the top crew or top producers like you're mentioning. So it's really exciting, but it's cool to think that you were on the vanguard there and that, among all of these things. But
yeah, I seem to have been. I didn't go looking for novelty, and I wasn't looking for things where I'd have to struggle. I just followed my weird little bliss. And it just so happened when I was being profiled by Richard Nally for Food and Wine magazine profile, Richard asked me, he says, "What's it like to have perennially unpopular taste?" And I said, "Just lucky."
Nice. That's a fantastic way to put it. I think that's a perfect place for us to end our conversation. Thanks so much for your time. I know we could go on for hours. I don't want to bombard our listeners with too much information, but this has been great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation and just for the invitation to let me let fly.
Oh, of course. It's been my pleasure. Thanks, Terry.
Stay well, my man.
All right. That was our interview with Terry Theise. I hope everybody learned a lot about German and Austrian wines, and I hope everybody goes and seeks them out. And if you want to compare your German Riesling next to your Austrian Riesling, you can get a Coravin. That way you can try multiple different wines from different producers without having to pop the cork. And that is our episode for this week. We will be back with another episode next week. Cheers.